So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we welcome you to a CE3C em Consciência, and we are very pleased to have as our speaker Pedro Beça, who I would like to thank in advance for being available to share his work with us. The conference will be recorded, so I ask anyone who does not want to appear to keep the video turned off. This video will be later available on CE3C YouTube channel. You can ask questions during the talk through the chat, or at the end you can ask Pedro directly. Pedro will be presented by Tiago Capella Lourenço, to whom I now give the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Pedro, for being available to present your work, and thank you everyone for joining this Encontro Ciência. So today we're going to talk about an issue which is very high on the current agenda, of course: water scarcity, droughts, etc. We know that the whole country is currently in a meteorological difficult situation with droughts, so we couldn't be more timely. The presentation of Pedro Beça. I'll briefly introduce him. Pedro has received his Ph.D. in environmental studies from the NOVA University of Lisbon in 2014, and he is now currently working with us at CE3C, focusing on climate services, hydrology, and water resource management. I'm very glad to introduce Pedro because Pedro is a very recent addition to the center. He was hired under the thematic line 6 climate services, and he's working directly with many of our colleagues on issues related with water scarcity and climate change. So his main research interests have been focusing on the application of information systems and mathematical modeling tools to hydrology and hydrodynamics. He focused on the assessment of water availability in watersheds, rivers, and reservoirs, and to evaluate climate change impacts on water resources, as well as the efficiency of the use of water in agriculture and issues related with integrated assessments of sustainability. With this in mind, Pedro is going to present us his work dealing with water scarcity and climate change, with a specific focus on agriculture and the Mediterranean. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think it could be coming in a more timely manner than the current situation that's unfolding in Portugal and in other parts of the Mediterranean. So Pedro, thank you again for presenting your work. Looking forward to hear you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for your presentation and introduction to my work. Yes, as Tiago said, Portugal is now facing a dire situation regarding drought, which is already affecting agriculture and livestock production. And so that was part of the reason I chose this topic at this time, because it's very in time. So I'll now share my screen with you in my presentation. I trust you can now see my screen. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to change to presentation mode. So I will be presenting to you part of my work regarding the evaluation of water resources and its availability under climate change. And I will be especially focusing on how it will affect agriculture in the future. So the objectives for this presentation are to first briefly introduce some of the main issues that are associated with water resources management, particularly in Portugal. Then I will present to you a case study that is located in the Guadiana River Basin, And this is representative of Mediterranean watershed. So many of the problems that we are facing now in Portugal, particularly in the south, are similar to that other countries are facing, especially in the Mediterranean. And I will try to promote the discussion on the future of agriculture in water scarce regions in the Mediterranean. One example is the Tejo that will be presenting. So water is one of the main drivers for economic and social development, while at the same time it has a basic function in maintaining the integrity of the natural environment. And as we can see here in this graphic, the use of water resources has been increasing in all the world. And this is mainly due to factors such as demographic changes and also the increase in water consumption per capita in some countries. In OECD countries, we can see that there's more or less constant water consumptions in the last 30 years. But in other countries, such as the BRICS and the rest of the world, this consumption has been increasing. And climate change further increases our stress on water resources. And so the traditional approach to consider the several uses of water in a separate way is no longer viable. In fact, we must move into an integrated water resources management approach. And this means that we need to look at the different uses and services that both people and the ecosystems need from water. And also we need to take into account, also, we need to take into account that water has no boundaries. I mean, the ocean is one whole body of water, although we call it the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, but in reality, the ocean is all connected because water is all connected, apart from a few separate, like the Black Sea. But even that is also connected to water vapor that travels in the atmosphere. And then we have rivers that they cross country borders and they flow into the ocean. So we need to think of water like the air we breathe, because water is connected throughout all the planet. And so the world has gone into major changes in recent decades. The increased pressure from demographics is uneven. It's much greater in developing countries. And this has been accompanied by an increase in the migration of populations from rural to urban areas. And also we have been witnessing refugee movements due to climatic and sometimes social and political factors. And all these issues have a very significant impact on the management and use of water resources. The demand for water has increased dramatically, as we have seen, and this is related with increased wealth, the demand for food, energy, consumer goods, and many others. And on the other hand, competition between users is increasing, which is resulting in difficult allocation decisions. And regarding climate change, there is growing evidence that changes in the Earth climate will force us humans to deal with an increasing variability and to adapt and build resilience, which will have implications for the availability of water resources. in particularly associated with the greater probability of extreme events, as we are witnessing now in Portugal, a severe situation of drought. But just a few weeks ago, we saw in Germany terrible flooding that never happened before. So this is the situation we are facing. At the same time, we have droughts and floods in different parts of the world. And so this is something we all know, but it's never, it's always good to remember that of all the water that we have in the planet, only 3% of it is fresh water, and of that, about 2% is frozen in the polar ice caps, ice in the mountains and permafrost. And so only 1% of all the water in the planet is available as fresh water. And of these, about 90% is underground water, and only 10% is available on the surface in rivers, lakes, and wetlands. Now, looking at the situation in Europe and the Mediterranean, this is an indicator of water stress, which measures the ratio between total water consumption and the renewable availability of surface and groundwater. And so we see that higher values that we have, especially in the Mediterranean region, show us that we are using almost all the resources available. So we have a very high intensity of water use in Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and also in other regions in France and Germany. You can also see the situation. Now in Portugal, this is the latest report from the Portuguese Environmental Agency from the end of January 2022. And we can see that Portugal generally has a diverse situation in the sense that generally in the north, there is no shortage. However, in the Alentejo, in the Algarve, the situation is not so good. And in the Alentejo, especially, the situation is sort of being compensated by the Alqueva reservoir, which is now transferring water to most of the reservoirs in the Guadiana, the Sado Basin. And so this is the map for the last day of January. And we can see also that now in the north of Portugal, as we have been hearing on the news, there is also scarcity of water. And so the situation is not looking very good for this year in terms of agriculture and livestock production. This is to show you the reach of the Alqueva reservoir transfer system. So these black lines represent the water transfer system that is coming from the Alqueva. And then in green, we have the agricultural areas that are currently under production. And then in orange, we have the expansion areas that are forecasted for the future. So the Alqueva reservoir, although it's a very large reservoir, it has a very high capacity. It's the only one we have in Portugal that is able to have reserves for several years, while most of the other reservoirs can only supply water for 1 or 2 years at the most. And so this is to show that the situation in the Guadiana and the Sado basins is now being compensated by these water transfer from the Alqueva. And most of the agricultural production is now being supplied by the Alqueva in these regions. And this is also alleviating the situation regarding urban water supply, because a lot of these reservoirs that have been traditionally supplying water to both agriculture and urban supply can now be have more availability for the urban supply. Now we'll be presenting to you a case study, which is located in the Guadiana Basin, and this is the Jebo watershed. And I will be showing you in particularly the two reservoirs who provide water for agriculture and also for human consumption, which are located here, the Monte Novo Basin and the Vigia Basin. And these are currently also dependent on the transfer from the Alqueva reservoir. So the Monte Novo reservoir is the main water supply for the city of Évora and the municipalities around Évora. So it currently provides water to about 65,000 people, and it provides water to an area of about 800 hectares of currently only one crop, which is olive groves. And this is an intensive grove of olive. This is a reservoir that became famous in the 1990s for the wrong reasons, because I think some of us remember hearing on the news that people were dying in the city of Évora, that these were people that were being treated in the hospital of Évora for dialysis, and they were being contaminated by aluminum. And this aluminum was coming from the water from this reservoir. Of course, that at the time, this was a unique situation. This was probably due to an illegal discharge on the reservoir. And unfortunately, some people died, but currently this is being monitored and it never happened again. But so this reservoir became famous for the wrong reasons at that time. And the Vigia reservoir has more or less the same capacity, although it's a little bit different because this one provides its main water uses for agriculture, and it has an irrigation perimeter of about 1,700 hectares. And here we have several crops, although the main area is dominated by olive groves and vineyard. And then we have all the others are seasonal crops, which vary from year to year. And one of the factors that influences farmers to decide which crop they will use in each year is going to be water availability. Now, taking a look at soil use in this region, we can see that in green here, we have the irrigation areas that are coming from these two reservoirs. And of course, most of the area is dominated by the Montado, which is represented here in orange. And there's also a very significant area dominated by non-irrigated crops. And I'm showing you a map that's a little bit old, but this is on purpose because more recent maps are showing the irrigated areas from the Alqueva. So now most of this region to the south of these reservoirs are now being occupied by irrigated areas from water that comes from the Alqueva. And so this is to show you the water availability in the last 20 years in the Vigia reservoir. And we can see that the situation is not very good. In fact, we have here two periods between 2004 and 2010, and then between 2016 and 2021, where the water level is very low. In fact, many times below 40% and sometimes even below 20%. So this is to show that the situation in Vigia Reservoir is more or less representative of what is happening in most of the reservoirs in the Tejo. And there are many years where we have water scarcity with tremendous implications for agriculture. And then another aspect that I would like to call your attention is that, okay, we can say that even if we have 20%, we can say, oh, there's still water, so it's not so bad. Well, but we have to take into account that, first, the reservoirs have got 3 main levels of storage pool. And there is the lower level, it's called an inactive storage pool, because usually we don't use this water. And what happens is that when the water level reaches this low, the water quality becomes very bad. And also near the bottom, we have sludge and we have a lot of sediments. And this is a water that's usable, but not very advisable to use it. And if we also take a look at what happens to water quality, this is a table that shows the growth of especially cyanobacteria that is very frequent in some of these reservoirs. And we can see that especially in the summertime, but also sometimes in the spring and the fall, we can see situations of algae bloom, which in some cases is dangerous because we have some nasty cyanobacteria growing, which becomes then a very difficult situation for the water treatment plants. And in fact, some of these water treatment plants in this region need to operate at a level that has a very high maintenance and very high costs to treat water that becomes easily polluted with this nasty stuff. And so the approach that I take is what's called a Cascade modeling approach, where I use climate models, data. So I don't do climate modeling, I use the data, mostly available in platforms such as the Cortex. And then I use this data to perform hydrological modeling, and with this estimate future water availability, and also work on what is called reservoir operation criteria, and deal with the water transfers management system, how it implicates the water availability and its capacity to provide water supply guarantees for the future. Now, these are the main steps that I take when, so first I analyze the climate models, and one important step to take is to perform the bias correction, especially to the precipitation values, which influence very significantly the runoff that I estimate from the hydrological models. Then I also estimate the potential evapotranspiration, and then I estimate crop water needs based on precipitation and also the potential evapotranspiration. And then with the results of the hydrological model, I perform the future water balances and estimate water availability for agriculture and other uses. So now I will present very briefly some of the results that I have obtained from the use of climate models. And we can see that in this region, the models foresee that there is a very significant increase in the potential evapotranspiration, which of course will become more significant later in this century, and also for the RCP 8.5 scenario. This is an estimate of the irrigation needs in this the Tejo watershed for the RCP 8.5 scenario. And so, as we can see in all these 8 models that I have analyzed, we can see that the models foresee an increase in irrigation needs, which is very significant and increasing throughout this century. And so the hydrological models has got several steps, of which I will not be discussing this in detail because this is very long and boring. But this is just to show you what I need to do. And then the outcome of this, as an example, is what I can obtain as reservoir levels. And this is the situation where I am considering that there is no transfer from the Alqueva reservoir for the Monte Novo reservoir. So as we can see, this is the water level for only 4 of the models. I only represent here 4 models because otherwise it becomes very confusing because it's too much lines in one graphic. And so we have 3 main lines here. This is the normal pool level. So this is when the reservoir is full. And this level here in the middle is a level that's considered the sustainable use of water for agriculture. So we can use water if we are above this level. Below this level, we have to restrain water use in agriculture. And then the level on the bottom here is the minimum withdrawal level. So this is the capacity to withdraw the water from the water abstraction tower. And so as we can see here, without the transfer system, there will be many months where the supply of water for urban will fail. So we can see here in this model, I estimate around 79 months in the period of 2021 to 2100, and other models also foresee failures in many months if there is no water transfer system. And then if we operate the water transfer system, then we are able to have a full reliability of the system with no fails for the urban supply system. Of course, that there will still be some months and for some models that we will go below the level that's considered reasonable for the supply of agriculture. And so there will be some restrictions for agriculture, even with the transfer system, because of course that this transfer system is limited in its capacity and also the costs are very high. And so I will also show you now what happens to the reliability of water supply in agriculture if we have no transfer system and operating the transfer system. And these are the values in each decade, so up to the year 2100 and for each of the 8 models. And then also I have here the average values for all the models and in all the period. And looking at the global average level, we can see that without the transfer system, we can achieve a reliability of about 79% with no transfer system. And with the transfer system, we can achieve a reliability of about 92%. This difference may not seem very much, but it's very significant for agriculture. And of course, as we can see, as we saw also, it's very significant for the urban supply. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about the implications of this for agriculture. And so first, I want us to look at, well, what are the crop water needs that are estimated from our Ministry of Agriculture for the Alentejo regions. These values are, of course, overestimated, and we can consider this as the top end of the water needs for each crop. And in reality, in many areas, the water need is going to be lower, and it also depends on how the farmer manages, and of course also the precipitation that we will have in each year. But with this, I just want to show you that there is a tremendous difference between, for example, a maize, which requires about 10,000 cubic meters per hectare per year. And we can look at other crops, such as, for example, the vineyard for wine, which requires about 3,000. Then we can look at the olive groves, both in the intensive and the traditional. And especially the traditional requires about half of the amount of water that the intensive olive grove requires. And I also included here two crops which are not very traditional or common in the Alentejo, but are now becoming popular, especially in the areas that are being fed by the Alquevo reservoir. These are crops that are traditional from other regions of the country, but they are now becoming popular in the Alentejo because they have water availability. But as we can see, especially for walnuts, the amount of water required is very high. So although there is water now, because it comes from the Alquevo to supply for these crops, maybe it's not such a good idea to think of a future where most of our areas in the Alentejo is going to feed very water-intensive crops. And I have done a simulation in the Vigia reservoir of the water supply reliability. If we use the water-intensive crops, this is the current situation that we have here in blue, where we have the intensive olive groves, and we also have maize in some years. And then this is in orange here, I have what will happen if we replace these water-intensive crops with the traditional crops. For example, if we replace the intensive olive groves with the traditional olive groves, and if we don't crop the maize, which consumes a lot of water, but if we crop, for example, wheat, which uses a lot less water. And so this is a situation without the transfer system. We can see that the water supply reliability can increase from about 80 to 90%. And with the transfer system, we can increase from 90 to about 96%. And so this is just to raise the awareness and promote the discussion on what crops should we think about as sustainable crops for water scarce regions, especially in the Alentejo and many other regions in the Mediterranean. Of course, this is not very popular for the farmers because the farmers don't like this sort of restrictions. But the reality is that we are already facing water scarcity, and the situation is likely to get worse in the future due to climate change. So this is a discussion that we need to have and to address these issues. And so now, as a form of wrap up, how should we promote sustainable water use? We have 3 main documents already in Portugal that foresee a lot of measures that are very important. Yeah? Someone spoke? No? No, okay. So we have the National Program for the Efficient Use of Water, and we have the Water Resources Economic and Financial Regime, and the River Basin Management Plans. And these are documents that already foresee a lot of measures that are very relevant. And many of them are still not yet implemented. And so what we need is to adopt and articulate the measures that are foreseen in these documents in a way that we can achieve a better sustainability in water use. So, for example, the National Program for the Efficient Use of Water already foresees for agriculture the reduction of water losses in the irrigation supply systems, and also the gross allocation of irrigation, especially considering these crops that are very intensive in water use. And for example, regarding the economic and financial regime, a very important aspect is that we achieve a balance between the revenues that are coming from the water taxes already in place and the real costs of water. Because the reality is that we don't pay for the real cost of water in the present. In fact, usually what we pay for is only the costs of the treatment and of the distribution systems. But the real cost of water, and especially the cost of using water in one use, and considering the costs of that it has, because when we use for something, we stop or reduce the use in other areas, then we need to adopt a wider concept of economic cost of water, which will allow us to maybe manage better the water use. And the other aspect that I would like to call your attention is for the licensing for the usage of water resources. Currently, we have our National Environmental Agency, which issues the permits, but its capacity to do monitoring and law enforcement is very limited. So this means that a lot of times farmers and industry and even individual users are extracting water from rivers, reservoirs, and groundwater, but there is no capacity from our environmental agency to monitor and to do law enforcement when the permits are not being used as they should, when people are extracting, for example, more water than they should, or they are not respecting the limits that are allowed. So this is an area that we in Portugal we need to address also. And of course, professional training and education is needed in all institutions. And so to finish off, I will just like to leave you a suggestion to visit a river beach located in the north of Portugal. We can see here really up north, almost close to Spain, we have a very nice river, a very nice river beach. So thank you, and I'm now open to your questions.
Thank you, Pedro. So now we have time. Thank you very much for your great presentation, really in the order of the day. So I don't know, we have lots of questions. So let me see. Ricardo, we can start. I hope you can use your microphone, yes.
Well, I don't know if you can hear me with this
Yes.
microphone.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
good. I didn't have a question. I was just clapping.
Oh, sorry.
Pedro,
I was quite fast.
Anyway, I can maybe take the opportunity and make a question which is not directly linked with what was presented today, but I see a growing narrative in Portugal about desalination. And I was wondering how could you frame it, and namely with the costs and the different options which are available instead of this one. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I don't know much about desalination, but I know that the costs are still very high, and it's being done in other countries. And we are now thinking about it in Portugal, especially in the Algarve, because the Algarve is now facing a situation of water scarcity, and of course that the Algarve is a little bit different situation from the rest of the country, because most of the water in Algarve is extracted from groundwater, whereas in the rest of the country, most of the water comes from reservoirs and rivers. And so the Algarve is a little bit different from the rest of the country. And so maybe in the Algarve, it makes sense to think about desalination now, because the capacity that's available in reservoirs and rivers is very limited, and the groundwater is being exhausted very significantly, especially in the last few years. So the groundwater resources are now quite low. In fact, we don't know exactly how low they are, but so maybe it makes sense now to do desalination in the Algarve. But my point is that in the rest of the country, there is still room to improve water efficiency use, especially in agriculture and the industry. We have seen a significant increase in efficiency in the urban supply systems, especially reducing water losses, but there are still significant losses in some distribution systems in agriculture and the industry. So there is still room for improvement in water efficiency, even with the existing water, without going to the more extreme situation of desalination. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you. I don't know if there are other questions.
Patricia, I think you have a question on the chat.
I do. Oh, sorry. I saw. Oh, yes. The Graça asked, do sustainable water use strategies include changing the current type and cover area of crops? I don't know, Graça, if you want to add something, or Pedro, you can answer.
It's exactly this question.
Yes. So Pedro.
Yeah, but Graça, maybe you can detail a little bit better what strategies are you talking about?
When you showed the slide about the current programs,
Oh,
national
okay.
programs to increase water use efficiency,
Yeah.
I don't know about these programs you listed there. So I just, this is a curiosity. Does any of them include changes in the type of species that are cultivated and the areas they can occupy?
Yes, the National Program for Water Use Efficiency talks about it a little bit, although,
Okay.
as I said, this is not a very popular theme for governments, and so the farmers don't like it when they see other people discussing and limiting their use of water, because farmers want to be free to do whatever crops they find more profitable, and so they don't want to be limited by water availability. But of course, that we are facing water scarcity, and this has been dominant in the last 20 years already, especially in the Alentejo and the Algarve. So we need to address this issue of crops, and we need to discuss if it makes sense to do water intensive crops in these water scarce regions. But the situation now, let me talk to you a little bit about what's happening with the Alqueva irrigated areas. In the Alqueva irrigated areas, the water that's allocated per hectare and per year, it's about 4,000 cubic meters. So it's enough to do crops such as vineyard and even intensive olive groves. But it's not enough to do, for example, maize or walnuts or almonds. So, of course, we can still have small areas of these crops, but we cannot have the majority of the areas with these water-intensive crops. So the majority of the areas, we need to think of them as not with crops with not so water intensive.
Do you have any modeling trying to take that into account? I mean, my idea is if you have studies with models that also show what can happen if crops are changed, perhaps this would help to convince someone more important to push towards this too, because I think efficiency and the types of crops are the main problems here that we have to solve.
Yes, as I showed in one of my last slides, replacing the more water-intensive crops with traditional olive groves, for example, and not cropping maize and cropping other crops, will increase the water availability and the water supply for the future. Yeah. And I have done some calculations. Yes, it is possible to show that we can improve water availability for the future if we use less water-intensive crops.
Thank you.
Okay.
So we have two more questions in the chat. The first one from Sergio. I will read it if you want to add, Sergio, something else. So the question is regarding the crop water needs you showed of traditional 1,760 cubic meters of acres per year versus intensive olive groves, and it says the number. I'm not sure that traditional olive groves were in fact irrigated. Could you tell us more about these values?
Yes, well, yeah, it's true that in the past the olive groves were not irrigated. But currently, especially in the Alentejo, most of the olive groves are irrigated. What we have is traditional plantations where there is less density in the trees, and we have the intensive olive groves, which are much more dense in trees. For example, in some intensive olive groves, we have one tree every 1.5 meters. I think it's the distance between trees, something like that, 1.5 meters. Whereas in the traditional, each tree would be distanced by at least 4 or 5 meters. And of course, that the trees are also different, because in these intensive olive groves, the trees are smaller, and each tree produces less than the larger trees. So to answer Sergio's question, yes, most of the olive groves are now irrigated, and there is a big difference between the water use of traditional olive groves and intensive olive groves. Okay, Sergio.
But just a question. They're saying they are not traditional. They are a different. Okay, we have intensive, super intensive, and all traditional olive groves that now are irrigated. But we can't tell them traditional. I think they are not traditional. Traditionally, they were not irrigated, probably. No?
Yeah, it's a question of naming the tradition.
But this is important, because we are working on traditional techniques, and we can say this is traditional, maybe, but this is okay. Thank you.
Okay.
So we have another question from Paulo Souza saying, thank you for your presentation. Do you think that in order to minimize this problem, we should increase the space of storage water, or work on the efficiency of water use, or any other strategy?
Okay, Paulo, it's a very good question. Yeah, I think we should especially work on the efficiency of water use, especially in agriculture and industry, where there is still a lot of room for improvement. About increase of storage space, we can consider it in some regions of the country, but in many regions we have to consider that there is not much rainfall that it's available to supply and to fill additional reservoirs. Of course, that this has to be analyzed basin by basin, and it's not true for all the country, but in some areas, the amount of precipitation that we have is very irregular, and in some years it's very low. So the reservoirs already existent are not being filled every year. And so if we put additional reservoirs, we will not have that much more storage capacity. So that's the problem, is that precipitation is low and it's becoming more irregular. And so we don't have much more capacity to increase storage, unfortunately.
And I don't know if everything is okay. So now we have a question from Helena Serrano saying thank you for the presentation also, and any thoughts on the transfer of water between Barragem do Cabril and Barragem de Belver, a 50-kilometer tunnel to supply water supposedly to maintain the water level in Tejo? Possible drawbacks: less water going to Castelo de Bode. Also, the water level between the Spanish border and the Belver Dam will still have low water levels, the code of 50 kilometers. This tunnel will only bring water to 50 kilometers also, Belver Constância.
Yeah, Helena, thank you for the question. So the Tejo is is facing an issue that's mainly related to the flows that are coming from Spain. And the fact is that we have an agreement with Spain, the Convenção Transfronteiriça. So I say it in Portuguese. I don't know the name for this in English. And the thing is that this convention foresees the flows that Spain has to give to Portugal every year. But it doesn't go as far as saying which flows they have to provide in every day. And so the situation in the Tejo is now becoming especially bad in the summertime, when the flows become very low. And just last year, we had a situation of an algae bloom in the Tejo because of the very low flows that were coming from Spain. And this is, of course, a major problem that it's very difficult to solve. But mainly we have to work on improving this water agreement with Spain, so that they can provide us a minimum amount of flow per day, especially in the summertime, when it's more likely that we will experience these water quality issues. And so this is the main issue now in the Tejo. It's the water quality because of the low water flows coming from Spain. Now, about this transfer system that Elena is talking about, I don't know this in detail, but maybe you know this better than me, Elena. So.
No, I just heard what the minister said, that they are planning to do a tunnel between these two dams.
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know if it will improve much or not. And I mean, the main issue is, as I said, is low water flows coming from Spain that have an implication on water quality, especially in the summer. So. Yeah, I don't know this project. I don't know what you will do today.
Because it's strange, because it only impacts an area of 50 kilometers, not the area closer to the border. And unless they plan to use the water for other things that we still don't know yet, those 50 kilometers, I don't think it will make much difference.
Yeah, probably not.
I don't know.
Probably not.
So we are almost finishing, but we still have two questions, so I will read them. One is a continuation of Elena's question. It's Ricardo added if there is a conflict of use with energy, EDP. If so, is this widespread to the rest of Portugal?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. There is a big problem with EDP all over the country, and this year we saw this on the news that because Portugal stopped producing energy from coal, what happened is that EDP increased the production from hydropower. So, for example, if you look at the levels in the Douro now, they are lower than the usual. They are at about 55% or something, whereas they should be at around 75% at this time of the year. So this means that EDP is already producing more than they should. They are using more water than they should in reservoirs because of this. And this is a very big problem, yes, because EDP operates reservoirs at its own discretion. And so they operate it as they own water, and they don't give a damn about other users, or they don't ask anyone, especially there should be a link or a previous agreement between the water authorities and EDP before they start using water and the way they do it, you know. And this is a big problem, yes, because EDP is now a private company and they operate the reservoirs as they own it. They operate it as they own water in Portugal, and they don't care about any other users, or they don't care about the authorities. And so this is mainly a political problem, because I think that what we need is to start imposing rules to EDP and the way they operate their hydropower.
And so our last question is, do you think that sustainable land management practices can help improving the water availability in the water? Is there asked?
Yeah, yes, of course. Yeah, because land management practices also mean that we should use crops that are less intensive in water, because associated with crops that are less intensive is also the use of fertilizers, pesticides, and many other aspects that influence water pollution and water use. And another aspect is, for example, this is an area where the soils are thin, and so the farmers use soil almost to the limit of its capacity, and they should allow for a more lengthier recovery time for the soil, you know. And so, which means that in some years they should leave the soil alone to recover nutrients and to recover basic ecosystem functions. But the farmers many times don't do it. They only do it if they see that the crop in that particular piece of land starts being non-productive, or they cannot get the profit that they want. But they should do what's called the soil resting in more years. Yes, that's true.
So thank you. Tiago?
Yes, Esther?
Tiago.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned now leaving the soil bare for some years as an important sustainable land management practice.
Sorry, Esther, we can hardly hear you. The sound is very bad.
Maybe like this? It's better?
A little bit. Yes.
Okay, wait. Sorry. Then I mute myself again. Sorry. Thank you for the answer.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Esther.
So, Tiago.
Thank you, Pedro, for this very interesting presentation and discussion. Just to add on what you were just talking about. Well, we have like 45% of the country in severe or extreme drought. Even the European Parliament is going to discuss the situation next week. But at the same time, we have the CAP, so the Portuguese Agricultural Confederation. The leader saying that one of the ways of associating the presence of people in the land and to fight desertification is through the intensification of agriculture, namely through irrigation. So it sort of seems that we have a sort of clash of interests and a clash of views towards the best way to fight climate change, water scarcity, and so on. So on one side, like you showed us, it has to deal with, we have to deal with less water or less available water, and include transfers in the system in order to just to sustain the levels we have today. But at the same time, many talk about changing crops, others talk about building more reservoirs, etc., etc. But then the agricultural narrative is very clear. We have to intensify more because that's the only way to get out of a situation of desertification. What are your thoughts about this? And what are your thoughts about what sort of research should we at CEDRC pursue in order to sort of shed some light into these necessary trade-offs of this very complex situation? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tejo. Yes, well, we have to, the country is very diverse from north to south. And in some areas, maybe we still have room to intensify agriculture, although I don't appreciate very much the term intensify agriculture, because I think that presently the farmers already intensify as much as they can the soil and the water and all the resources that they have available, because they are driven by profit. They want the maximum profit that they can get. So they will use the resources available in the way that suits them, which, as I was just telling Esther, sometimes the soil is being used at an unsustainable way, because there should be more time for the soil to recover its functions. And namely, this has implications in several ecosystem functions that affect other species and biodiversity. So this has to be, of course, analyzed from region to region, and maybe in some areas you can still increase the area of irrigated agriculture. But as I was presenting the case in Alentejo, I don't think it makes sense to increase much more than we already have. We already have a very significant expansion of the areas irrigated by the Alqueva now. So the Alqueva was originally, it was supposed to provide water to an area of about 110,000 hectares, and it's now providing water to 180,000 hectares in the Alentejo, and they still foresee an increase in this. And so at one point, even the Alqueva, which is the biggest reservoir we have, and it's one of the biggest in Europe, will not be enough to supply water for all this area. So we are close to reaching the limit of the Alqueva and the irrigation areas that we can expand. So this is the case in the Alentejo, and also I think that we should also think about the crops that make sense in water scarce regions. So maybe in the 3C we can talk a little bit more about this. Think about which crops make sense for certain parts of the country, and which crops allow us to reach a more sustainable water use and improve water availability and also water quality for the future. So I think this is the way we should go.
Thank you so much, Pedro, and thank you all for this great talk and conversation and discussion. And so I hope to see you next week in the next Encontro Ciência. And I would like to say once more, Pedro, great, and thank you for your work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, bye.